And welcome back to this Bites episode, a continuation of these three-part episodes that we're doing that looks at Russian lies and deceit that in some way went to inform the meeting in the White House between Trump and Zelenskyy, with, of course, Witkoff and others chiming in. As we noted in the other episode, Zelenskyy has demonstrated an extraordinary courage under duress during and after the disastrous meeting at the White House on Friday. He must be commended for not slipping into appeasement of Trump and his illiterate, incompetent, and ineffective cohort of thugs and morons, as well as sycophants. The Ukrainian president responded to all the unreasonable pressure, the coercion and humiliation with the extraordinary line, "We will give nothing to Russia and forget nothing." Zelensky's position is clear. There will be no retreat from Donbas. Ukraine's position is unchanged. The most charitable line to adopt here is that Trump is giving Putin another chance to pull back from hostilities. A more cynical interpretation is that he is helping Putin to waste time, distract Ukraine's allies, and dissuade them from offering full support for Ukraine, as well as injecting false narratives and unreasonable coercion into the process. It also buys time for Putin to muster yet more resources for senseless assaults on Ukraine driven by delusional beliefs that he can break the new war paradigm of battlefield stalemate through technology that delivers transparency and unmanned capabilities that can destroy enemy armor and forces. This revolution favors the innovative defender rather than the massed attacker. But it seems that neither Putin nor many of his leading generals really understand this yet. At the same time, the US is starting to push Russian gas out of the European market. That is one small positive to take from the situation. Through cooperation with Europe and possibly the US, Ukraine can create energy resilience through the construction of 9 new power units. But Zelenskyy rightly stresses there are decisions that Ukraine has no right to make, even under pressure, such as ceding territory to Russia that it does not occupy, that does not belong to it, and which it could not win in 11 plus long years of warfare. Russia has insisted that the Donbas speaks Russian and therefore belongs in some form to Moscow. In the meeting, as the FT reports, Trump promoted Putin's talking points, including the absurd notion that the Donbas should be surrendered. This narrative that language or ethnicity equates to territory is central to Moscow's imperial claims and has been widely rejected by Kyiv and its more sensible Western allies. Yet the US in this meeting appears to give that lie new legitimacy. This episode is about the return of Russian lies and threats to center stage. I want to tackle that main lie that Donbass is Russia head on. Those lies and myths are once more being used as the basis of coercive pressure, amplified by the US president and his administration to force a capitulation on Ukraine. But Russia is not operating from a position of unassailable strength, and the US has very little skin in the game at this point in the war. Let's turn to the extraordinary journalist Ilya Ponomarenko to debunk one of the main lies, and his words will form the core argument of this episode. There is no one better to express the opposition to Moscow's lies, and this specific one about Donbass in particular. Ilya is a Ukrainian, a journalist from Donbas, and seeks to explain a few obvious things to a New York real estate developer. He means, of course, Steve Witkoff, who seems to care a lot more about the commercial opportunities being dangled in front of him by Putin and his mob fixer, Kirill Dmitriev, than he does about Ukraine. Ilya points out the grotesque optics of someone so ignorant of context, speaking so casually about matters that will affect the fate, life, and even death for millions of people in a region he likely cannot even place on a map. We already know that Witkoff struggles to even remember the names of these places, these obelisks, as demonstrated in a meeting with Putin prior to the misconceived Alaska summit. Real life is a bit more complicated than a primitive two-color map where Ukrainian regions divided into Ukrainian-speaking and Russia-speaking, explains Ilya. Speaking Russian in everyday life does not mean wanting to live under Russian rule and the dictatorship of Vladimir Putin. It doesn't mean that you're somehow by default obliged to belong to Russia or serve the imperial whims of Vladimir Putin. Ilya notes that since the 2014 invasion, the Kremlin has unleashed conflict that has almost completely destroyed Donbas and is on the point of erasing the fighting age male population of that region entirely. Russia has destroyed the very people it claimed to be coming to save and has ravaged their economy, their lands, their homes, their cities, their environment, and their industries. That horror opened countless eyes, Ilya explained, and finally shattered many illusions about what the so-called Russian world really is. A plague, bringing death and cemeteries among the ruins of once prosperous cities like Mariupol and Bakhmut. The Russian myths that Trump is regurgitating are pernicious and pervasive. Ilya tackles them head on. You might be surprised, he said, but back in 2014, the main centres for forming volunteer battalions were not Lviv or Ternopil. They were Russian-speaking cities like Dnipro and Kharkiv. They created and filled numerous famed units made up of local residents who took up arms to repel Russia's hybrid invasion of Donbas when the regular army and the state were in collapse and paralysis. This is because Russian-speaking Ukrainians already understood perfectly well what was happening and made a final, irreversible choice in favor of Ukraine and freedom. And here we come to another line popular amongst Russian assets in public forums and on social media, that if only a referendum could be held in Donbas now to decide which way it should go, permanently to Russia or back to Ukraine, that was apparently suppressing the people there. I've been arguing with just such assets, agents, and useful idiots this week, as well as over the last 4 years, on LinkedIn and X, repeating these same absurdities over and over again. Firstly, no free and fair referendum can be carried out in Russian-occupied territory it controls, and no free and fair referendum has ever been carried out in those circumstances. International observers and due process will not be allowed in Donbas. But even this ignores that there are now tens of thousands of Russian colonists bust into those territories and given the spoils of war, land and apartments stolen from the Ukrainian residents that were expelled or slaughtered. There are many more tens of thousands of workers shipped in by Russia from other of its former colonies in Central Asia, etc. Well, expect them not to have a free vote in the process, but to be coerced to vote entirely the way the Kremlin tells them to. But what of the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians that may well have voted to remain with Ukraine, but are now lying in mass graves, massacred by Russian forces? Their voices will never be heard. Ilya explains further, you might be surprised again, but when the Kremlin's assets, collaborators, saboteurs, and unmarked Russian regular forces occupied Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014 to 15, the majority of the region's educated, entrepreneurial, and democratic-minded population fled those people's republics, which quickly turned into depressed criminal cesspools. They left their homes and apartments and moved to areas under Ukrainian control, to Kyiv and to its peaceful suburbs like Irpin and Bucha, where so many fellow Donetsk natives started new lives from scratch. Then in 2022, Russia brought slaughter and destruction to those areas to which they had fled, those areas which had become a haven for the refugees from the east, refugees from Russia's endless wars. Ilya has a message for self-proclaimed experts and journalists. Even in Donbas, pro-Russian, Russian-speaking people never identified themselves as ethnic Russians, only as Ukrainians who just happen to speak Russian. Russian war propaganda has tried to burn the phrase Russians in Donbas into our collective brains, and it's disappointing in the extreme to hear this, the fattest and juiciest lie, being thrown around in the White House by witless and clueless morons like Steve Witkoff. Does he think he knows better than Ilya, someone born in Volnovka who grew up and lived there most of his life? Witkoff is deluded and mistaken, and because of his ignorance, he's easy to manipulate it. But let's face it, he hasn't even tried to find out the truth or do any research. That's because these people that inhabit, that infest the corridors of the White House are entitled, lazy, corrupt, nepotistic, and hubristic to a dangerous degree. Ilya continues, believe it or not, even now in the fourth year of Russia's full-scale slaughter in the so-called Russian-speaking regions, masses of Russian-speaking Ukrainians have fled and settled in Kyiv, Lviv, or Chernivtsi, something you can easily notice just by walking through those cities. And many more Russian-speaking Ukrainians are fighting right now in the Ukrainian army on the front lines against the Russian plague that came to their land. Ilya says we have long been part of the Ukrainian nation, part of its political and cultural space. Our capital is ancient Kiev, not Moscow. We argue about and criticize Ukrainian politicians whose decisions shape our lives. We took part in revolutions, the elections, the wars for this country. We cheer for the Ukrainian football team, for Ukrainian singers at Eurovision. And here's another myth, that Russian-speaking Ukrainians are more aligned to the so-called Great Russian culture than the literature, music, and culture of their own land. Most of us, says Ilya, one way or another, see Ukraine as our country and our future. And today, more than ever in modern history, we are further from the Russian cultural space and closer to our fellow Ukrainians from Lviv, Lutsk, Ternopil, and Vinnytsia than ever before. Through Russia's relentless aggression, the force of the Russian language in Ukraine has weakened and is dissipating extremely rapidly. Many of us, says Ilya, from the Russian-speaking regions have already switched to Ukrainian in daily life and in public, returning to the embrace of Ukrainian culture and tradition and rejecting Russian with disgust and anger because we don't want to have anything in common with the fascist Russia of today, which brings only bloodlust, war, hatred, chauvinism, aggression, and the deceitful hypocrisy of its brainwashing television propaganda. Ilya concludes, until our last breath, we will want nothing to do with your Russia. After all it has done, killing our friends, relatives, taking our homes and turning our Russian-speaking cities into vast cemeteries amid ruins where life will never return. Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series KYIV of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. KYIV of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. KYIV of Mine is a fast-paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work, the very antithesis, in fact, of a doom-laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend, operator Starsky, says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times, and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kiev's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution
through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Julian Ellis, filmmaker on KYIV of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. A final word from our partners, the makers of KYIV of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.